Welcome to Reepham, a beautifully tranquil market town located in the heart of the wonderful Norfolk countryside. Home to just over 2,000 people, Reepham may not be the largest town in Norfolk, but it's a place full of riveting history and things to see. And on this walk around the town centre on a gorgeous summer's evening, we'll explore everything from the colourful marketplace to the historic Dial House, while we'll also look into the story behind the eye-catching town sign, and then venture out towards one of the town's long-since closed railway stations, which is still open to explore. All of that is to come over the next 25 minutes, as we make our way around this delightful town. But we begin our walk in Reepham's enchanting parish churchyard, which is unlike any other in the entire country. This churchyard is home to not just one, not even two, but three churches. That's right, Reepham is the only place in Britain to have three churches standing on one site, and it's actually one of only two places in all of Europe to boast a trio of neighbouring places of worship. Standing tall in the heart of the churchyard here is St Michael's Church, which is more than 700 years old, originally constructed around the time of the 14th century. Behind it, meanwhile, we can see the tower of St Mary's Church, which is believed to be slightly older, likely dating to the early 13th century, making it more than 800 years old. Now, these two medieval churches, which stand back to back, are the most prominent in the town of Reepham. But we mentioned that this churchyard is famous for its three churches, so where can we find the third one? Well, if we turn around, we'll find the churchyard's third place of worship just here, or at least what remains of it. Known as All Saints' Church, this was likely the very first church to be built on this site. But today, all that remains of All Saints above ground is this ruined piece of the church's porch wall, with fragments of the building's wider foundations still present beneath our feet here. Now, you'll be wondering exactly what happened to All Saints' Church. It's most commonly suggested that the building was simply destroyed in a fire all the way back in 1543, and simply never rebuilt. The fire didn't reduce All Saints to the small remains that we see today, though. In fact, the church's old tower, which would have stood roughly where this bush is, and much of its ruined walls, were actually left standing here for more than 250 years, finally demolished in 1796 when its stones were used to expand St Michael's and St Mary's. So one church may lie in ruins today, but we haven't yet got to the bottom of exactly why the town of Reepham ever had three churches in the first place, though we can look to local folklore for a story that might give us the answer. This is Reepham's town sign, a common feature of towns and villages across Norfolk, and it features a beautiful illustration of the town's three churches, as well as three monks, three farmers, three cows, three sheep, and three sisters. And according to local legend, it was after these three sisters fell out with one another that they decided to build three separate churches, one for each of them. In all likelihood, this local legend is a fictional tale, and the real reason for Reepham's three churches is much more ambiguous, shrouded in the mystery of time and the complexities of medieval politics, which we'll explain a little later on in our walk when we return to the parish churchyard. But as we now make our way along the town's streets with the sun setting above us, let's quickly turn our attention to exactly where you'd find Reepham in the vast county of Norfolk. As we mentioned, Reepham is located in the heart of Norfolk's countryside, roughly 10 miles away from the towns of Dereham and Fakenham, and the city of Norwich, as the crow flies. Today, many of the people who live in Reepham travel to work in Norwich or one of the other larger market towns nearby, but this town is still home to its own tight-knit community. This beautiful building, for example, is the Bircham Centre, which has served as Reepham's main community centre since it was donated to the townspeople back in 1919. Although the building is much older, parts of it dating back as far as the 17th century, when it was known by a different name, Hackford House. And for much of its life, what is now the Bircham Centre has been neighboured by the King's Arms here, a historic coaching inn that opened all the way back in 1667. Quaint and beautiful both inside and out, in the building's facade just here you can also see a large doorway, a signal that this inn used to serve people arriving in the town by horse and carriage. This was because Reepham lies on what was historically the main route across Norfolk, and as such the King's Arms provided food, drink and shelter to travellers making the lengthy journey across the county. And while making a pit stop in Reepham, people may have also indulged in a pie or two. And we know this thanks to this quaintly named alleyway, Pudding Pie Alley. Pudding Pie Alley links the marketplace with Back Street, which despite its name was actually once the main road through Reepham, lined with shops that were well known for selling delicious pies, hence the name for Pudding Pie Alley, which also provides an entrance here to the delightful garden around the back of the Bircham Centre, a regular venue for community events. Now, in a couple of minutes' time, we'll make our way to the other end of Pudding Pie Alley as we take a walk along Back Street, which was the main route through town for around 500 years. Today, though, the main road passes through the heart of the Market Place here, the central open space in Reepham on which traditional markets have been held for centuries, and which is also surrounded by a wealth of utterly gorgeous historic buildings. Markets have an illustrious history in Reepham, held in the town since at least 1277, nearly 750 years ago. But the Market Place has a rather more recent appearance, surrounded by buildings dating mostly from the Georgian era, between 200 and 300 years ago. And one of the most prominent Georgian buildings in the heart of Reepham is this, the beautiful Dial House, which takes its name from the easily recognisable sundial on the front of the building. With each of its segments representing half an hour, the sundial is accompanied by a Latin inscription, which reads, Horas non numero nisi serenas, and that translates to, I only count the sunny hours. And you might even be able to make out that the shadow cast on the sundial now, by the beautiful evening sunshine, tells us that it's around 7 o'clock. The dial is the most famous feature of the Dial House, which today acts as a luxurious local hotel. Though for many years beforehand, the building was better known as the headquarters of the Reepham Brewery, a local brewery with more than 13 pubs across the region. Though the Reepham Brewery eventually closed down in 2009, brewing remains in operation just on the outskirts of the town centre at the modern Panther Brewery, where the tradition of centuries of brewing in this historic market town continues in earnest. But as we mentioned a few moments ago, despite the fact that Reepham is a town with at least 1,000 years of history under its belt, the beautiful marketplace here is actually one of the newest parts of the town, as it was redeveloped in the 18th century, and is therefore surrounded by a wealth of beautiful buildings from that era. Here we find a colourful row of buildings lining the south side of the marketplace, and like much of the town centre, they were built in the Georgian era, notably featuring Flemish architectural influences, as has been common across Norfolk for centuries. Now, when most of these buildings were built on the marketplace, they served as houses, as most of the buying and selling was done outside on the open-air square. Some, like Diane's Pantry and the antique store just here, have since been converted into shops, but others remain in use as private homes, the lovely and sensibly named Blue House here being just one example. Of course, as a town home to just over 2,000 people, Reepham is a place where the local community is really rather close, and as such the town is full of independently run businesses, which help to contribute to the quaint, village-like atmosphere on the streets. Though despite that, don't forget that Reepham is actually classified as a market town, and it has been ever since 1277, when it was first granted the rights to hold markets by the then King Edward I. But despite being located in the depths of the Norfolk countryside, Reepham has long been ideally positioned as a venue for local markets. Because as we can see from this helpful road sign, the town is surrounded by a wealth of small villages, whose residents historically needed a market within easy walking distance. Although people from Whitwell, Bordeswell, Corston and more could reach the market town of Aylsham, 7 miles away, or even the city of Norwich, 13 miles away, when carting goods back and forth across the countryside, this could prove a little too far. So Reepham, in the middle of all these villages, stood out as a readily accessible centre for rural trade, where farmers could walk to and from the market rather more comfortably within one day. As we know, however, in the medieval era, the marketplace wasn't the main route that people passing through Reepham followed. It was rather this street, the much narrower Back Street. Back Street, which is visibly older than the road through the marketplace, actually follows the route of a more than 1,000-year-old road that was historically used by people to cross Norfolk between east and west. And for many centuries it was along this street that you would have found the bulk of Reepham's shops and businesses. Nowadays, most of the Georgian buildings on the south side of the marketplace, which we were just looking at, back onto Back Street here. While this charming lane is also home to rows of fetching little cottages too. But why was it that this historically significant street was eventually relegated to the much less important status that it holds today? Well, the many medieval houses and shops that once lined Back Street were burned down in a great fire of 1543, likely the same fire that destroyed All Saints' Church, the ruins of which we saw at the start of our walk. The fire, which broke out across the town on the 18th of April that year, was likely the most catastrophic in all of Reepham's history, though we can't be exactly sure what caused the blaze. It was possibly an accident that may have started in one of the many pie shops along this road, though it's also possible that the fire was no accident at all, but rather caused by violent Protestant reformers who targeted the historic All Saints' Church. After all, the year 1543 was right in the midst of the sweeping religious reformation across England under King Henry VIII. Whatever the true cause of the fire, that's why this once significant road has lost its many historic houses and shops, though it is home to Reepham's small town hall. This building, which dates to 1860, having once upon a time served as a local school, composed of just one large room, before it was later converted into the town hall that we know today. But when it was a school, the building wasn't actually designed to serve the people of Reepham, but rather those who lived in the separate parishes of Hackford and Whitwell. A Church of England school for the parish of Reepham had already opened a year earlier in 1859, and that's the modern Reepham Primary School. But given the sprawling and rural nature of the surrounding region, the three neighbouring parishes of Reepham, Hackford and Whitwell have all historically used this one town as a centre of activity. And that, as we return to the churchyard once again, gives us the best answer as to why there are 3 churches in this one churchyard. Though all 3 of these churches are located within the town of Reepham, they were all built to serve a separate parish each. Here, for example, we're looking up at St Michael's Church, which was built as the parish church of Whitwell, although today it's no longer used as an active place of worship, used more often as a kind of church hall for community purposes. Linking to it here at the back of the churchyard, meanwhile, is St Mary's Church, which is the parish church of Reepham, and today the only active place of worship remaining in this churchyard. Meanwhile, the ruined Church of All Saints just across the churchyard was once upon a time the parish church of Hackford, thereby creating a trio of neighbouring churches that were all designed to serve people from 3 different areas. But there's a little more to explain as to why the 3 churches were all built in the same place right next to one another, and we'll pick that up in a moment. But here in the corner of this busy churchyard we find an important memorial, placed here in 2010, which stands in memory of the people of Reepham who died during the Black Death of the 14th century, and were likely never identified and given a resting place of their own. The Black Death, a devastating pandemic which killed around a third of England's entire population, had an immense effect up and down the country, especially in small rural communities like here in Reepham, as large proportions of the people who farmed the fields were lost to the plague, leaving those who survived struggling to cover for the lost labour, not to mention struggling to cope with the loss of the people themselves. The Black Death and the Great Fire of 1543 likely brought about a period of centuries of decline here in Reepham, before the later redevelopment of the town in the Georgian era. But through it all, this fascinating churchyard has stood largely unscathed, with the exception of All Saints' Church, of course. But why would three separate parishes all decide to cram their own churches into one town's churchyard? Well, we mentioned that the sprawling and rural nature of the surrounding region was in part a reason for this, principally because the neighbouring parishes of Whitwell and Hackford were, and still are, so small that it was difficult to support a church in their local area. Hackford, a few miles to the west of here, is mostly composed of fields, a few houses, and the large country manor house known as Hackford Hall, although that was built much later in history in the 17th century. Whitwell, about a mile to the south of here, is similarly rural and only home to a scattering of houses. And as such, most people who lived in both of these parishes would more often than not be spending their time here in Reepham, when not at home or working the fields, as this town was home to the region's main market, a number of inns and more. As such, putting the three churches in this one town actually made worship more convenient for the people of all three parishes, while it also prevented any one church from falling into neglect by being left out in the middle of the countryside with just a handful of people to support it. So, as we look up at the now conjoined St Mary's and St Michael's churches, now you know why Reepham is the only place in Britain with three churches in one churchyard. Although across Norfolk you will also find an unusually high number of towns with two churches built next to one another, likely for similar reasons to what we've found here. But having looked into the history of Reepham's famous churchyard, explored the beautiful Market Place, and strolled along the once bustling back street, we've come to the bottom of Church Hill, which brings us close to the edge of the compact town centre. On this corner, the main road through Reepham changes its name to Norwich Road, and as that name suggests, it leads out of the town and towards the city of Norwich, which is about 12 miles away as the crow flies, but more like 15 miles when following the roads. Now, if you're looking to visit Reepham while you're in Norwich, the town is served by a bus from the big city 3 times a day, and it takes about an hour to get here. There are other buses to nearby Aylsham and more, but the relatively scarce public transport here means that most locals need to drive to head out of the town. But that wasn't always the case. As we make our way down the beautiful Norwich Road, lined by a row of gorgeous houses and shops here, you might be surprised to learn that this small countryside market town was once linked to the city of Norwich by rail, not just by one, but by 2 local stations. So, as the sun sets over the town centre, we're going to briefly fade to black. And when we come back, we'll have made our way over to the edge of Reepham, where we can get a closer look at one of those historic railway stations. Located a short walk to the north of Reepham, just here we find what was once upon a time Reepham Railway Station, the older of the 2 local railway stations. Opened back in May of 1882, the station here was built by the East Norfolk Railway, on a line that linked the village of Wroxham, the so-called capital of the Norfolk Broads, with Aylsham, Reepham, and then Broome Green Junction, which connected to the line to Dereham. As you can see, the old station is now home to a local eatery, which is popular with locals. And on sunny evenings like this, it's a delight to sit outside and enjoy a drink or a meal in the surroundings of what was once upon a time the old goods yard, and a revolutionary place of activity for this small rural town. Of course, having spent the vast majority of its history defined by its relative isolation, the construction of a railway station here at Reepham was a game changer. And within a few short years, this goods yard was almost constantly bustling with activity, as everything from coal to livestock, farm produce and more was loaded onto trains and distributed across the rest of Norfolk. But as we look over the path of the old railway track, it wasn't just goods that loaded onto trains from this platform. There were as many as 12 passenger trains that stopped at Reepham every day during the peak of the railway in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, making this town better connected than ever before. However, Reepham Station here still didn't provide people with a direct connection to Norwich. But that wasn't a problem, because just 2 months after this station opened, another opened on the other side of town, which did offer direct train services to the big city. That station, opened in July of 1882, was originally named Whitwell and Reepham Railway Station, as it was located in Whitwell to the south of Reepham, and it was built by the Midland and Great Northern Joint Railway on the line from King's Lynn and Cromer to Norwich. But despite offering a direct link to Norwich and many larger settlements across Norfolk, Whitwell Station was generally less popular with locals compared with Reepham Station here, simply because it was located a further distance away from the town centre. Ultimately, both stations eventually fell out of favour in the post-war years, when more and more people began buying their own cars. Reepham Station here closed to passengers in 1952, and even after it was linked to the line to Norwich by a newly built loop, known as the Themmelthorpe Curve, it never reopened, with Whitwell Station closing shortly after in 1964. Goods trains did still pass through this station until as late as 1982, but afterwards the old railway track was ripped up, and the two station buildings were left to neglect. Nowadays, though, Reepham's twin stations have undergone quite a renaissance. The station building here is home to that local eatery, while Whitwell and Reepham was reopened back in 2009 as a dedicated heritage museum, which is complete with its own section of track, where you can take a ride on a delightful old steam engine too. As for the route of the old railway itself, you'll notice that that has also been repurposed into a wonderful long-distance footpath, which is known as the Marriott's Way. Following the former route of the railway all the way from Norwich, around Reepham, and finally to the market town of Aylsham, the Marriott's Way is more than 24 miles long, passing through acres of stunning countryside scenery along the way. The way takes its name from William Marriott, who was once upon a time the chief engineer of the Midland and Great Northern Joint Railway, who built the original line through Whitwell Station. And as well as beautiful views, the path is also littered with an array of intriguing railway heritage. Here, just along from Reepham Station, for example, we find a former railway crossing gate, which now serves as a welcome, or a farewell, to anyone walking through Reepham along the route. And having now ventured to the very edge of this captivating countryside town, it's here on the Marriott's Way that we've come to the end of our walk around Reepham. A town of 3 churches, 2 stations, a beautiful marketplace, and so much more, Reepham may be small, but it's a town with a lot to offer anyone who comes to visit. So thank you very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you're now looking forward to making your own visit to Reepham sometime soon.